The Hemingway-Fitzgerald Incident. The time Ernest Hemingway had to rescue F. Scott Fitzgerald from himself. Paris in the mid-1920s was more than a city. It was a crossroads for young artists escaping prohibition, old rules, and the weight of the countries they'd left behind. Montparnasse cafés overflowed with cigarette smoke and arguments about novels that hadn't been written yet. Painters traded canvases for drinks, and writers scribbled in notebooks as if time were running out. The dollar was strong, wine was cheap, and for a few strange golden years, the city made geniuses believe they might actually become themselves. Into this world walked Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald. Hemingway was not yet the legend, just a determined young writer with a boxer's posture and a newspaperman's discipline. He worked in cold apartments, drafted stories in cafés, and believed suffering improved style. Fitzgerald, meanwhile, arrived as a celebrity. This side of paradise, and The Great Gatsby, had already given him a place in the literary firmament. But fame brought pressure, and Paris, beautiful, indulgent Paris, magnified every crack in his life. And then came the afternoon that would expose the truth of who they both were. Fitzgerald knocked on Hemingway's door looking like a man escaping disaster. Pale, sweating, trembling, he announced that he had a fever, an intense, potentially fatal one. The streets outside were humming with late-day chatter, but Fitzgerald seemed sealed off from all of it, caught inside a private crisis. Hemingway had spent the day writing, sharpening sentences like knives. Now he was faced with a friend whose imagination had turned ferociously inward. Fitzgerald wasn't performing. His hypochondria, well known among his peers, could seize him completely, and this time it had taken hold with alarming force. Hemingway led him outside. Paris was its usual self. Boulevards lined with chestnut trees, cafés setting out evening tables, the smell of roasted coffee drifting into the streets. The city was calm. Fitzgerald was not. As they walked, he kept returning to the fear that his temperature was rising by the minute. Hemingway tried to steady him, but the worry traveled with them like a shadow. They stopped at a café, one of those narrow Montparnasse rooms crowded with chatter and clinking glasses. Fitzgerald anxiously asked for a thermometer. Of course, there wasn't one, so Hemingway took him to a pharmacy. Inside, Fitzgerald took his temperature. Then he took it again, and again. Each time, the reading was normal, perfectly normal, and something shifted. The tightness in his voice loosened, the panic drained from his face, and he seemed suddenly smaller, almost boyish, as if he had been returned from the edge of a cliff. Only he could see. Nothing dramatic had happened in the streets, no storms, no collapses, yet the emotional intensity was real. Hemingway could feel it. He saw plainly that Fitzgerald's brilliance and fragility were intertwined. The same imagination that produced Gatsby's shimmering world could also imprison him in fears that felt life-threatening. The Paris evening continued around them. Waiters shouting orders, cars rumbling over cobblestones, the early glow of café lamps flickering against the windows. And there, in the middle of it, two of the century's greatest writers walked home. One steadier now, the other quietly considering what he had learned. Years later, in A Movable Feast, Hemingway described the incident with affection and exasperation. The tone of someone who understood that genius sometimes comes wrapped in nerves, doubt, and a pulse quickened by shadows. The Hemingway-Fitzgerald incident endures not for spectacle, but for revelation. In a city pulsing with artistic ambition, it captured two futures in motion. Hemingway, ascending through discipline and force. Fitzgerald, shimmering and fragile, trying to hold on to the fire that had made him famous. In that strange, tender afternoon, two writers moving through Paris in search of a thermometer. The entire dynamic of their friendship was laid bare. Brilliance and instability, loyalty and frustration, the fierce gravity that sometimes pulls great talents together. And Paris, as always, watched silently, knowing it had seen this pattern before. If you enjoyed this literary incident, Subscribe for more strange intersections from the history of writing.